Hello and welcome to the Womb Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Jessica Huckabee and I have Janet Brent with me here. Thank you so much for joining us, Janet. I've been collaborating with Janet on publication projects here for a little while. And actually we're getting ready to publish. Is it all right if I announce the book? We're getting ready to publish a collaborative book called Birth, coming up in the next number of months. So keep your ears perked and your eyes perked for announcements about that. And today, however, we are here to talk about ancestral healing as part of the Ancestral Healing podcast series. So, Janet, I would love for you to introduce yourself a little bit more and share about your experience and process around ancestral healing.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here. So my name is Janet Brent. I'm a book doula, a 4 times bestselling author. I think it's hard to keep track through my multi-author book collaborations that I facilitate and co-facilitate. I'm the owner of Dark Horse Publishing, and I've taken over 120 entrepreneurs and coaches to best-selling author through these book collaborations. So it's a lot of fun, and I also do solo books as well. I got my start through graphic web design because I was really into publication design, so that led me to the publication or publishing route.
Yes, I've been learning a lot about publication, and it is a tricky field. So I just want to celebrate your expertise and express gratitude for your support that you've given me along my tumultuous journey to become a published author. So I'm super grateful for that with you. And, it's very tender to have our voices be heard through becoming a published book author. I certainly am out there writing blogs and social media posts and having a podcast, and all those things seem a lot easier than actually becoming a published author. So it's so wonderful. Anybody who's out there, and I've done self-publishing in the past. I used to make homemade self-bound poetry books that I published and sold at the newsstand. But nowadays, with all the self-publishing technology and all the things that go along with that, it's not as easy as it sounds at first. And so I'm super grateful, and anyone out there that might be considering that, I highly recommend Janet as an ally and a resource for that journey. And I also just want to say a few words, and I'd love for you to share about how becoming a published author feels like an ancestral healing in and of itself, especially if we are writing from our unique perspective. Each of us has a unique perspective. Each of us has had a unique journey. And I know in my book writing process and projects, the healing has been a central part of what I'm writing about, and bringing forth my unique identity, my unique message is very much influenced by the ancestral lineage that has given me the gifts and challenges that ultimately result in even more gifts that I have to offer in a book project, in a publication, that then when we write it in a book, we have the opportunity to share with the world and bring the wisdom of our lineage into the world. And so just this book publishing process seems quite relevant to the ancestral healing journey, especially since a lot of the perspectives that I write about were silenced for many generations, were not valued. Many of the ancestors that I connect with didn't have the opportunity to to write down their perspective and publish it in a book, and share it with the world. And so it feels like, being the first published book author in my lineage feels like a big healing, and I imagine others might relate to that as well. So I'm really curious to hear about your ancestral healing journey and how it relates to this work, publishing books.
Yeah, it is a huge undertaking, and one of my like slogans for the book publishing is to break generational curses through like having your message be your movement. And as you were talking, there was something that came through for me or struck for me, like your gifts and challenges and just that whole journey. And my insight is that your challenges are your gifts, because it's kind of like that other side of the coin of the challenge. Um, you may have heard advice where people say that when you are going through like a challenge or a problem, quote unquote, and that is usually the thing that you're meant to teach about. And that's because it's that hero's journey, right? When you go through your trials and tribulations and challenges, you have your dark night of the soul, you come through on the other side of that transformation with that gold, that gift, and you can then alchemize that into this knowing, this knowledge, and then this mentorship. You become the mentor, the teacher, and the guide. And that's what you sort of come home to. I call it coming home to your divinity, but it's all tied into the ancestral work. And I didn't even realize it. It was actually my business partner when we teamed up. That was her original slogan, was the breaking generational curses. And before her, that wasn't really in my like thought. I wasn't really even thinking of it in that way before. And so it was just like breaking new layers of understanding, because after we partnered and there was something there about the breaking generational curses, I wanted to like delve deeper, and I ended up taking a ancestral healing program called DNA codes. And so I learned a lot there in relationship to the ancestors, and how when you're like the one who goes first, or the one who breaks the pattern, then you can live, basically it's like you're living your legacy, and you can change your story and you can write your own story. And that's the power in it. The power of writing is such a healing process.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, it's been a central process for me, writing an ancestral healing journey, in that, you know, rewriting even not only my own story, but the story of my ancestors as well, has been part of my writing from the womb journey, of really connecting with the ancestors that I might have little bits and pieces of information about, and then writing in the story to fill in between those bits and pieces, has been this fascinating journey of discovery of, and whether or not I'm accurate in rewriting the story doesn't really matter, because it's a healing of the story in a lot of ways. So it's not about writing accurately the actual story of this ancestor's life. It's about writing a healing into the story. For me, that's been my process with writing. And what I'm also hearing you share about is perhaps a healing process in writing about our challenges from a different perspective, and the transformation in writing a book. Because usually if we have a book to write, we're writing about a transformation that we went through personally, and wisdom that we can now articulate that we didn't have at a certain point, right? We're looking back on our story, what happened to us in the past, perhaps even what happened to our ancestors, patterns, perhaps. What I hear you talking about with ancestral curses, the way I understand that term is that there are patterns that we might be stuck in because our ancestors, and they might not be very healthy patterns of living or structures in our lives that we might be stuck in because it got passed down to us in our DNA. Our whole biochemistry might be sort of wired in that way to be in certain unhealthy patterns of living. And all of humanity is sort of struggling with big ancestral curses as we speak, of how do we get free of some of these systemic structural patterns that are really unhealthy and self-destructive. And so each of us individually discovering ways to liberate ourselves from those patterns, those ancestral curses, if you will. There's so many different terms for that. There, epigenetics is one way of talking about it. DNA codes, patterns is one way to talk about it. There's, all kinds of psychological theories about how of development, of how we develop, growing up. I talk a lot about what happens when we're conceived and when we're gestated in our mother's womb, and the way that programs our DNA. And so I'm curious to hear more about what you learned in that course, working with the DNA, and how it helped you personally. Perhaps you have a specific story that you can tell us, because storytelling, right?
Yeah.
A specific story about how you, through whatever process that you were learning, you managed to liberate yourself from a specific pattern that you can describe and relate to your ancestral patterning that you inherited, but then managed to flip it or shift it or find the pearl in the oyster, if you will.
I would say that my journey is still ongoing in process of, but
me too. Isn't it for us all, right? We have a lot of generations of ancestral curses to process, right? But we can pick one that might have gotten to, a place of transformation.
Yeah, there's never any destination. I think the journey is a destination.
Yes, indeed.
That's part of it. So it's kind of funny, but in the middle of the course, the halfway mark, I ended up getting a mini stroke, or it was like a brain bleed, a small brain bleed in my brain, or there's other words for it. There's so many, I forget like the technical terms, and brain bleed or brain hemorrhage, but one of those things. And it was caused because of my high blood pressure. And that is definitely a patterning that has been from generation to generation. I don't know my biological dad. I never met him, so that part isn't clear for me. But as far as my ancestry on my mom's side, everyone had it. Everyone had high blood pressure, or some have had strokes, like the actual big strokes, the major strokes, things like that. So that does run in my family history for sure. And it was a point in time when I was also probably at my most heaviest, and I was in a hypertensive crisis. Like my high blood pressure was so elevated that in the scale of from good normal blood pressure to like the pre hypertension, I was at the very top end of the scale, or like blowing off the charts, which is like you wouldn't have thought of that for me if you just see me normally. And just the doctors were kind of even surprised by it because I look so young, and I am young. I'm still 38. And so that process just helped me to see that I needed to slow down and just come back to that self-care, that come back to pleasure,
Mhm.
because I wasn't really in my pleasure, like in terms of finding what feels good in my day-to-day life and really being in that more present moment feeling. And so after the fact, I'm still on my blood pressure medication, on new ones, because part of the reason I was in hypertensive crisis was because I didn't take my blood pressure medicine for 3 years.
Mm.
And so it was just like kept kept getting really bad until this and it happened during a time of not being in control of my emotions, so not having emotional mastery as well. I
Mm.
had like a really angry burst. And so I think the lesson that I learned is that, again, like I needed to slow down, and that I was starting to maybe figure out how to eat better, or like have better eating choices. And I also felt like I had a third eye awakening after the stroke. Like I almost felt like there was more clarity that came through.
Mm.
And in terms of my purpose in life, or what I need to do to get my business more successful, or just different ways to continue to expand, that expansion process. And so I launched Rebel Romance, which is my very latest multi-author book collaboration, and I've been able to fill that more easily than other book collaborations. And it is more of a pleasure based, like I'm embodying more pleasure, but as that is happening, like the program is also about being in your pleasure
Mm.
and all of these things. And like without even really, so the stroke happened in mid-June, and now it's first week October, early October, without even really trying, because I wasn't trying to lose weight. I was just trying to feel better and make better decisions, change the way I eat, even if it's not perfect. Not to like, uh, not to beat yourself up if it's not perfect,
Mhm.
but just to be more mindful. So this like more mindfulness practice coming back into what I do. And I've been able to lose 9 pounds since the stroke happened. And that wasn't like, I wasn't trying to do it, and I'm not like working out. I'm still not working out really. I'm just doing more movement in terms of like the kriyas that I do is a very like movement meditation, because there's a lot of hand gestures when you do the kundalini kriyas and breath work. So I feel that. And then I also do some dance flow sometimes, but again, not like regularly. It's just whenever I feel like it.
Wow, quite a journey. And it's interesting because I've just been studying about um, studying cardiology. I shared with you before we got on the call that I've been going back to school, moving towards becoming a pelvic floor physical therapist. I think this might be the first time I've shared that on the podcast. Um, and I'm just in the sort of prerequisite coursework of anatomy, and just went through the whole segment on cardiology and learning about what causes high blood pressure. And I've had fairly minor heart palpitations, but I know that high blood pressure does run in my family as well. My grandmother struggled for many years with high blood pressure, and it really affects the brain too. That was one of the main concerns, but she was also struggling with Alzheimer's. And we're not sure exactly how what caused her to finally pass in the end. She just sort of didn't really wake up all the way one day and didn't eat, and by that night she was gone. And since there was a do not resuscitate order. She was in her late 80s and suffering from pretty severe dementia, so and rapidly progressing dementia. So there was a do not resuscitate order in her chart. So, and the facility she was at honored that. And so there was no big medical intervention when she didn't quite wake up all the way. They just notified the family, and we were able to say our goodbyes, and she passed very peacefully, actually. So we're not sure if it had something to do with her heart, but in any case, the well-being of our heart, and my heart personally, and its relationship to our stress levels, anxiety, the brain, the nervous system, and how our blood flows. And then ancestry is all about our blood connection. We call that our blood, right? Our blood ancestry.
True, yeah.
Isn't that what we call it? And our heart is how our blood circulates through us. And we can think about blood in a biological way, of the viscous fluid that transports oxygen and nutrients throughout our body and helps to eliminate waste. We also have a very spiritual idea about blood. And in fact, in Chinese medicine, blood has a much more energetic, much more expansive quality to it. When you talk about blood deficiency, it's not just a deficiency in the physical blood in your body, but it's also a deficiency of a certain kind of nourished energy, of being nourished by our energy and by our ancestry and by our blood, right? Our blood connections and that community of ancestry that we have. And then, of course, we have the relationship with our menstrual blood, and how our blood flows as womb bearers and menstruators. And I know you're a mom too, so the blood that we nourish our descendants with, that's the blood connection, right? And we talk about the blood-brain barrier and how our blood is nourishing our brain. And now here you're talking about this bleed in your brain. And so I'm just fascinated that this topic is coming up here through your story and your journey with healing this ancestral lineage of hypertension. And my work, I call my work biomystical, right? So there's the biological qualities of these types of things, and then there's the mystical aspects, and where they come together is where I love to explore. And so hypertension, or high blood pressure, as far as I understand, because I was just in all the anatomy of it, is where what I understand is that, and why it's related to diet, is that when there's stress, our blood vessels, our arteries and our blood vessels can have some damage that might happen when we have toxins or stress. And in order to patch up the damage in the blood vessels, our body sort of collects fats there, and that can build up and become hardened in order to fortify the blood vessels, because it's really important that our blood vessels aren't leaking out through holes and damage, right? So our body really tries to fortify that, but then that builds up, because what happens is we have cells that try to break that down and gobble up those excess fats, but then they overeat, and then they turn into a bigger, foamier thing, because they die. They overeat and they die, those cells. And then that's what creates a bigger and bigger like buildup of fats on the insides of our blood vessels, which constricts the amount of space where the blood can flow. And it also diminishes the amount of action in the blood vessels themselves, because the arteries particularly have a muscular quality where they're pumping the blood and keeping the blood moving freely, just like the heart contracts and relaxes in order to pump the blood to flow through the body. The arteries are also pumping and contracting. And then, so that's usually where that buildup becomes a problem, that buildup of fats and dead cells that have overeaten fats. I just think it's so ironic that the same thing that's happening on the macro level, that maybe we're eating too many of the kinds of foods that aren't so good for us, is also happening on this micro level of these cells are trying to like get rid of this excess fats, and then they kill themselves overeating. And then they become this buildup. So then that hardening restricts the amount that the arteries can be involved in pumping the blood, and it restricts the space where the blood can flow through. So then the heart has to work harder, and there's more pressure because there's less space, right? And there's less movement in the arteries. And so blood pressure medication usually thins the blood so that it can flow more freely and make the work of the heart easier to get through that. But if you have blockages in there that are really restricting the flow of the blood, and they can actually block the flow of the blood, it can become problematic for the heart, or whatever area that artery is feeding, right? And the ones that are most serious are the ones that are feeding the heart itself. And that's when we get a heart attack, is when the coronary arteries, because the heart uses like a huge amount more oxygen to keep pumping every day, all day long and all night long. It uses a huge amount of oxygen, and it needs full blood flow to itself in order to keep going. But when we have that buildup of fats on the inside of the arteries, and they get blocked, and part of the heart isn't getting the blood flow that it needs, then that's when we have a heart attack. But also, like in the brain, if there's high blood pressure and there are weakened parts of the arteries and veins, then that's when blood can leak into the brain. And that's what you're talking about too. So that's where the blood comes out into the brain. And I'm just geeking out on the anatomy of all of this, and maybe this is information you already know, but looking at all of this, then if we look at that in the biological and anatomical sense, it's one thing. And then if we look at it in the spiritual sense, it's in the mystical sense, it starts to have another meaning. And already in what you were sharing, this sense of having more movement just in your life and what gives you pleasure. Because the other thing that causes that tension is when our nervous system is stuck in fight and flight mode. And that's what causes the damage to the arteries and veins in the first place, because when we're in fight and flight mode all the time, there's certain biochemicals that are released into our system that causes damage to the arteries and veins, because we're only supposed to be in fight and flight mode 10 minutes a week. That's what we're designed. But the cortisol all the time, those hormones all the time, cause damage to our tissues, which then has this other effect, right? And so, but pleasure is the opposite of that. And pleasure is the remedy for that. And just looking back on our ancestry, how many of our ancestors got to focus on pleasure? No, they had to fight and run for their lives often, most of the time. It was a constant struggle just to survive in many of our ancestors. I don't know if you've looked into some of those stories and what that is for you, but I know in my lineage, it was definitely struggle, 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 struggle. And pleasure was not only not available, it was also often quite forbidden
Mm,
and taboo to even focus on, especially like sensual sexual pleasure, which is what I'm
right.
assuming your Rebel Romance book has an
Mhm,
aspect of that, right? This
mhm,
it sounds somewhat of like an erotic stories kind of compilation,
yeah.
which sounds kind of fun and exciting. But for many of our ancestors, that kind of pleasure, pursuing that kind of pleasure, was taboo and forbidden. And so it's all of this is quite a turnaround from what many of our ancestors experienced, what you're describing. And so I'm curious, uh, what kind of connections you've made between these practices that are so healing for you, of focusing on pleasure and focusing on pleasurable movement, because that's what I'm hearing you say, is that you want to focus on dance and these, spiritually enlivening movement practices like breath and kundalini kriyas and things like that I find to be quite pleasurable and quite enlivening in a very different way than, say, going to the gym and doing a workout, much more pleasure oriented.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you've made some connections with the kinds of relationships that your ancestry, your mom, your grandmother, your grandparents, your great grandparents might have had with pleasure, and whether or not that was taboo, as you
Mm.
know, when you were growing up, what did your parents teach you particularly about sexual pleasure, and is that a revolution in and of itself to be claiming that for yourself?
That's a great question. I uncovered in my DNA codes program a bit more about my ancestry because I didn't know anything about my ancestry before that. But I actually found out that at least my great great, is it great great or great great great
Few
uncle,
generations back, right?
yeah, kind of far back, but not too far back, or it still feels close. My great 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 uncle and his family had a tobacco business, and then they also started a sugarcane business. And so at one point they were one of the wealthiest families in Cebu Island, Philippines, and they owned a lot of properties in Cebu, the majority of the properties at one point. And so it was like they had three businesses, like real estate, sugarcane, and tobacco. And then they decided to open a organization. It's like a not for profit organization for like a home for the aged, for people who are elderly and don't have a place to stay or are poverty stricken or things like that. And it still runs today. I think they founded it in 1921 or the 1920s sometime. And it still runs today. And part of his legacy he left behind, when he died, in his will, it said that all of his properties would go to this home for the aged, and the people who will are able to run the home are in our family, the Kui family. So I feel like there is some wealth in my family, but at some point it kind of like gets kind of diluted, like the telephone game or
Mm.
something like that, where like my side of the family maybe like sort of lost their way or just didn't really get that side of the aspect of being able to run this home for the aged. because I think there's other Cree families that are running it right now, not directly my family or like my family line. And so that was part of my realization, as I'm here to also help reactivate the wealth frequency, but also in terms of pleasure, like my mom didn't really talk much about it. And I was born without a biological dad. Like, so I was like, um, when you don't have a dad on the will, I was like, forget what I'm blanking on the name.
You mean your dad wasn't on your birth certificate?
No. Yeah, that's right.
And my dad wasn't on my birth certificate either, but there's a specific term for that. I've never heard a
Oh
specific
yeah.
term for that.
I'm blanking on it. It starts with an I think.
I don't know the term for that either. You must have had a biological father. He just wasn't around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she's never talked about that incident. And so I don't know anything about that circumstances. I don't know the story behind it. I do have a first name of who my biological dad is, but I forget the last name because she only scribbled it down on a piece of paper like a year ago to me when I asked about it. And she didn't say anything about it. She just showed me the paper, and again, no context of what it is, no story behind it. So I I wasn't able to remember the name because I didn't really have a context for it. So I feel like that pleasure is something that has been shamed before in my family, or has been something like almost embarrassing. And even when I was a kid, like, when you're just naturally, as kids, you explore yourself, your body, and it's not thing to be shameful of. But she caught me when I was 8. I just felt like I didn't know what it was. Obviously, I didn't know the name masturbation, or I've never heard of the term, but like I just remember discovering that it feels good to touch yourself down there. And I would only do it over the panties because it never occurred to me to like not have the underwear there as a barrier. But so that's what I would be doing under the covers. And she caught me one time and told me not to do it anymore. And I felt really embarrassed and ashamed without the context of it being embarrassing in the first place.
Right.
So that's kind of like the story that I've had to overcome, and really reclaiming my pleasure.
Mm.
But pleasure is not just, the sensual and sexual. It's just anything that feels good, anything that you desire. Like if you want to have ice cream or something, then eat ice cream without any guilt.
Mm-hmm. And
Or
so were there other contexts besides being caught pleasuring yourself under the covers? Were there other things that were pleasurable for you growing up that your mom that was discouraged in your family? And I mean,
yeah.
and I'm just curious about the lifestyle, because it sounds like your mom was probably a single mom, at least for a period of time, which can be quite a struggle. I don't know exactly where you grew up. If when did your family come to the US?
Yeah, I was 3 years old. I think I was like 2 or 3 months before turning 4. So I was almost 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And because my mom had married an American,
Mm-hmm.
and again, like pleasure not being necessarily sensual, doesn't have to mean sensual things, ways that they kind of stopped me from having pleasure is just like when I was younger, I really liked this summer school programs where I would have like these activity workbooks that I could do during summer breaks, and math and English type subjects. And I really loved doing them. And then they stopped giving me that because it was like a monthly service, I'm sure, or some sort of thing where they had to pay money for it. They stopped giving that to me, and I really liked it. They had, remember there was like a poster that you could hang up on your wall that shows your progress, or like it was kind of like a path type thing that you could do.
Mm-hmm.
And they took that away. And at one point I wanted to do take ballet classes, and it never happened.
Mm.
So just different things like that where I wasn't able to fully explore all of my interests.
Mm. And what about your parents? Did you see them following a path of pleasure, or did they have different motivations? I mean, most of us, my parents' pleasure was not a legitimate motivating priority, right? And just in the general culture, pleasure is not legitimized as a motivating priority. And so I'm curious, I mean, we absorb that from our parents, right? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say that wasn't a priority for them. Didn't have a lot of extracurricular things going on, or I
What
just
what do you
Hmm?
you just remember?
I just remember like mostly them working
Mhm.
and then just being in the house watching TV or reading the newspaper.
Mhm.
Like my dad would be doing that. Didn't really interact with me much.
Yeah. Yeah. So work being the priority.
Hmm.
That's quite a legacy that I think is quite universal, or in our collective awareness, that and deliberately so. I mean, our public school system is designed to train us to be good workers,
Hmm.
and that that sort of channels most people into that role of just being focused on work and setting pleasure aside. And it sounds like, with your recognizing this shift and this healing for your health, to reprioritize pleasure and to reclaim the possibility of wealth from your family lineage. And I'm curious about that. um I mean, it doesn't seem like you're on the trajectory to create wealth in the same way that your great 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 uncles did, necessarily. But that you talked about wealth being a frequency, which sounds to me like, we have the frequency of being the worker bee that we were just talking about, where it's not about pleasure, it's just about working, working, working. And
Oh.
and then it sounds like you're talking about a different frequency, a different way of living life, that perhaps your great 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 uncles were after, or managed to create for themselves and the family. But not in a creepy way either. I mean, they were offering, what I hope was a valuable service to the community, but doing so in a way that um, perhaps had a different frequency. And I'd be curious to hear more about their story, and how we can pair that wealth frequency with the pleasure frequency, because there's plenty of people out there that are trying to claim the wealth frequency, but they're just as much of a worker, work all the time, even though they're owning this and owning that and having all kinds of wealth and like that. They're still in that work all the time, never have any pleasure frequency. So I'm curious about how you feel you're being guided to weave those two together. It's very easy to just apply that work mode to the acquisition of wealth goal.
Oh.
Right.
I love this conversation, and I don't know if my ancestors were in a pleasure frequency or not.
Mhm.
I do know that they were one of the top philanthropists in Cebu.
Mhm.
As like he basically gave up all his wealth when he died to for this organization that he had co-founded with his sister. So my great great aunt or great 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 aunt, and
Uh-huh.
so they were both the two in the family, the two siblings that did not have kids, were not wed. They never married in their lives. And so I know he had like a big Spanish style house. And at one point, he had wanted to adopt one of his um, relatives, like maybe a grandson or grandniece or something like that, but it never pushed through. I don't know if they were in the pleasure frequency.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I mean, sometimes the unwed, child-free people in the lineage have more
Mm,
to their story than meets the eye, right? I mean, in the mainstream storyline of things, if you don't everybody wants to know, well, who did they marry and who were their kids? And if they didn't
right.
have either of those things, they kind of fall to the wayside and nobody asks any more questions, right? But but that's where I start getting curious. Well, what were their priorities then? Where did they invest all of that energy? And obviously, we know that they were philanthropists and that they, were in service to for the elderly. What happened in that beautiful home, and what did they do with that wealth, and what was their approach to life? And this is where the writing process for me starts to fill in the blanks of in the ancestral healing journey, because we can imagine what that was like and connect with the spirit of our ancestors, because that spirit is in our DNA. We can have the essence, the energetic of those memories. We can access that in our DNA. And I'm imagining that's some of what you explored in this coursework, and that you might be curious to explore more. And that's where the writing process takes me, is like filling in the blanks and imagining what was their life like, and what would it be like to have a conversation with them and ask them some of these questions in a meditative journey type thing. In the writing, you write out an interview with Uncle so and so. Like what?
It's very mystical because I do feel a sense that I was almost being led to this course
Uh-huh.
so that I could uncover this family lineage that I had no idea about,
Uh-huh.
um, to sort of remind myself of who I am and to be able to reactivate that well frequency. So I almost feel like it's like my great great uncle wanted me to find this information and wanted me to know him and connect with him.
Mm.
And because what I do know is if you are not wed in the early 1850s or things like that, that you're kind of unconventional for
Yeah.
sure. Is it? And I'm unconventional as well.
Right. Right. That's like the mystery, like, and those unconventional people kind of get written out of the family story because there's all this taboo around what might they be doing, right? Well, those are the people I want to get to know. What were they doing? What was going on for them, right? Yeah. Well, wonderful. Well, goodness, I could keep conversing with you, asking more questions. But I think our time is winding down. So we talked earlier about an offering that you have. I guess it's a journal book for folks. Can you share a little bit more about that you're also going to be adding more into it about
Mhm.
to help people get in touch with their ancestry as well? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is for a book around uncovering your gold, like uncovering the gifts that you're here to offer in this world. And if you are offering a business behind that or not. I feel it's really helpful, and it's got some journal prompts on ways to connect more with your ancestors and how that all relates with your gifts and the genius that you're here to portray, and that you're here to be a part of and connect with the world in your own unique way.
Mhm. And as we've been talking today, it sounds like you're inspired to add more in there about connecting with your ancestry as your ancestral connection journey is developing. So,
Mhm.
so how might folks get a hold of this book? Can they find it on your website, or how can they get a
Yeah,
hold of it?
it's on my website, and the link will be in the notes.
Okay, in the show notes. Great. So we'll put the show notes, we'll put the link to get this. This is a free ebook. Is that right? So people can
Mhm.
use
A
this
workbook.
journal, a workbook. Okay. So it's like a journal where there's journaling prompts that people can write, answer the questions in the workbook. So it's your pleasure thing. You love those workbooks, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So you turn it into something to offer to others to enjoy, who enjoy that as
Mhm.
well. So wonderful. So we'll put the link in there. And listeners also know that if you want to join us in the Womb Centered Healing Temple for an ancestral healing month-long exploration, you can learn more about that by going to wombcenteredhealing.com and clicking under the online courses tab. You'll find the ancestral healing course there. You can also sign up for the newsletter and listen to more of these ancestral healing podcast episodes. You'll see, if you found this one, if you look at the other videos or audio episodes on whatever platform that you found us, you'll see the other interviews with other ancestral healing practitioners. So listen in and join us on this journey of growth and learning and reclaiming the wisdom of our ancestors. And yeah, any last words before we close out, Janet? Any last words of wisdom?
Um, I'd just say to continue to live your own legacy, like you are the creator of your own life, and you can live the way that you want to live it and feel so much better when you do that, when you find what feels good in your heart, what your passions are, and then go for those passions.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. All right, that's all for now. Until next time, take good care.